You mentioned the Intercontinental Railroad.
Yes.
You mentioned the interstate system. I mean, it's not like we haven't dreamed big and produced big in the past. What do you think of this moment now? I mean, and this is going back to the question of leadership, I think,
Yes.
but what are your thoughts there? And you touch on many of these in the book, so.
Yeah, so I mean, in the history of rail, you have to look at the Transcontinental Railroad.
Yes.
And many people point to that as the glorious past, and why couldn't it be like that today? But when I dug into the history, which is fascinating, it wasn't so glorious because it took decades of discussion.
Yes.
And no one really did it until Abraham Lincoln forced it through.
Even during a time of war.
In the Civil War.
That's
Isn't
right.
that amazing?
Yes.
And there were a lot of compromises that had to be made. It didn't work perfectly. The tracks started to be laid from the East Coast and the West Coast, and they didn't meet in the middle. So that took extra money to fix it.
Yes.
And there were tales of corruption. That was how J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller made their fortunes and started monopolies. But we could do it. We could envision that big project because we were envisioning the growth of the U.S.
Yes.
from coast to coast. And how do you use that coast-to-coast territory? You're not going to connect it by stagecoach.
No.
The railroad connected it, and it made it possible for farmers to ship their products east to get goods coming back west. It made it possible for settlements to spring up. We know that. You know that well,
Yes.
too, from your time as Secretary of Transportation, that every time you put in a transit stop, you get economic
Development.
growth.
That's exactly right.
People build around that. So we did it then, but as I was going to say, it has lessons for today because it wasn't all that easy. It did take a leader
Yes.
who managed to forge the coalitions and get the political will. We've had other big, interstate highways was big, really big. Like the Transcontinental Railroad, it had a defense rationale. And it was a big, bold project. It was at 41,000 miles of highways and a huge price tag. It opened up all kinds of opportunities and
Touched
it helped
every state. Yes.
Yeah, and it helped the American economy after the war. It helped settlements because the suburbs were already there, but they could grow even more because people could live in the bucolic, idyllic, green suburbs, supposedly, and get to work in cities. Cities were kind of abandoned at that time. We can get back to that later. But this defense rationale that we've had for all our big projects, including Sputnik, the space race, the Cold War, those investments on defense grounds, some of them are a little spurious because President Eisenhower, who wanted the interstate highways, said we could move troops and we could evacuate cities. Well, in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005, it was clear you can't evacuate cities by everybody piling in their cars and heading for the interstate. It doesn't work. So while those were really great rationales at the time, I also say we're stuck in the past. We haven't had big visions or big enough visions since the 1950s, maybe the early 1960s, about the role that these projects play in our future. We have some beautiful infrastructure developments. There's a gorgeous bridge in Boston, a signature bridge, we say. It's like a piece of sculpture that people admire. There are other fantastic bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge.
Oh, yes. I love this discussion.
They're beautiful works of art, but they also are not a vision for what we need to do to connect people and help them move across those bridges.
Yes.
So it's time for a really big new vision that takes into account the 21st century. That's what you were trying to do in your
It is.
Vision 2000.
Yes.